students and so on, but I'm not teaching. So
Okay. Well,
we have
okay.
family here in Denver. So we were in Colorado before we moved to Toronto.
I,
It's been about 17 years,
uh,
but things have changed.
that okay. That's okay. Well, I'll come back to that. So this is one of my friends here, Todd Littleton. Todd, introduce
Hi, Todd.
yourself.
Hello, Ephraim. My name's Todd Littleton. I pastor in just outside of Oklahoma City, and
Great. Nice to see you.
my claim to fame is I'm a friend of Jason Micheli's. So
Yeah,
uh,
well, we're all famous because of other people. I realize that.
so you mentioning being from it just occurred to me that I've read a lot of your books, and I did some work in Canada a couple of years ago, and I met a lot of your former students. Um, but I don't actually know your biography, and it seems appropriate given that Mortal Goods is the product of you trying to write to your family, and so. If you can, just where are you from? How did you get to do what it is that you've done? Just give us a little bit of your story.
Sure. Well, basically, I grew up in Berkeley, California, where my father taught at the university in the 60s and early 70s. And so I passed through a certain trial by fire culturally of the place and era. Um, which probably explains a lot. I mention a little of that in the book, where I grew up in Berkeley and sort of the political culture of the time. I was very much, as a youngster, could be involved in that. I think I mentioned how
Hmm.
the school I went to, they great school. They got us passing out flyers for the Black Panthers and this and that. It was all pretty interesting at the time. I was in the middle of the People's Park. We would run around as kids and enjoy the riots and the tear gas and all the rest of it. And also, by the same token, was not personally, except through family members, involved in a drug culture that blossomed and took down with it quite a few people in different ways. Um, I moved on and eventually went to University College on the East Coast. So I left Northern California. I've been back to visit, but I've never really lived there since.
Hmm.
Um, and I became a Christian as a teenager in basically in Berkeley, and began attending church there on my own. Um, and my family life was not easy at the time, so I think there was something that was offered through all of that in the church that was quite important, and in finding the gospel proclaimed to me in a very personal way. So that got me on the track. At university, I became more and more involved in Christian life, the church, student ministries, and went to seminary after that. So my first job right out of seminary was working in Burundi, Africa, as a missionary of the Episcopal Church. They had those at the time. Most of that has disappeared by now.
I was just going to make a
Um,
joke.
but yeah, I know. But it's too bad. But on the other hand, it was the end of an era, and I was grateful for that. And worked in teaching and other things in Burundi as a young man. And it was sort of in between two civil wars, a very difficult time, but fortunately not one of a lot of overt violence. Again, I talk about some of that in my book.
Hmm.
And on returning, I was eventually arrested and kicked out, deported for sort of fake political stuff. But I came back to the U.S. in '85 and worked in parishes in New York, in Cleveland. I got married, then went back to graduate school where I got my doctorate, and then continued pastoring and doing some teaching. And that's what took me to Colorado initially. So I worked in Colorado for about 10 years. As I say, pastoring, I was sort of an archdeacon in charge, if you will, of a set of congregations in mostly rural, small town, southeast Colorado. And then I went to Wycliffe. I did some writing while I was there and some teaching in Denver, but it was basically a pastoral life I had with some of my own little thinking and writing.
Hmm.
And then I went to Wycliffe and the University of Toronto, where I was for about 16 years. So having just retired from teaching, our young adult kids and other family live in Denver. So we moved back to Denver a couple of months ago.
Is your since so much of your life has been steeped in mission work and in parish ministry, does that account for kind of your eclectic interests academically? Writing commentary on scripture, the figurative interpretation of scripture, you know,
Well,
political
I
theology.
suppose. I mean, I went to graduate. I got my doctorate a little later than some. Nowadays, maybe not so much, but I do look at those who went to graduate school right after, which was still done at the time when I graduated from with a BA, right after their undergraduate years. And it's a different academic culture you're nurtured in when you do that. You become a kind of scholar with a certain set of habits and disciplines and expectations, which frankly I never got. And coming back to graduate school after 10 years plus of both missionary and then pastoral work, yeah, I came at it with some different questions and also without the same kinds of skills, I would say, that somebody who was always in there. I mean, I'm grateful for that, but I also miss some things that I never got in the same way. So that my scholarly work is honed. I think you're right in a different way. Eclectic to some extent. So the questions I ask, I think, are ones that attempt to hold my academic interests, despite the fact that people think I'm hard to understand and abstract and this, that, and the other. I attempt to hold them accountable to concrete realities of existential Christian life in both, the society and the church in ways that are not simply beholden to the traditions of scholarly discourse. So perhaps, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the scriptural stuff, the figural stuff, all of that. I think I talk a little about the scriptural stuff in the introduction to my book on time and the word, on figural reading. A lot of that was actually formed or percolating already in Africa. So it was the experience.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that in the book, actually. Yeah.
Living in a different kind of ecclesial Christian culture where scripture has a different life, really, which challenged me to think differently about that. But then again, my doctoral work in a very scholarly way engaged that. So it wasn't sort of out of the blue. I did my dissertation on Jansenism, and especially 17th, 18th century Jansenism, which was deeply involved in thinking about how scripture and the life of the church and, if you will, society intersect in an almost metaphysical way. And so that was a place where I learned some of these things in a both historical and theological manner. Granted, ones that are marginal to the major discourse of theological scholarship, still to this day, despite the fact that it's gotten a little bit of more attention in the last decade or so.
Yeah.
And I think the missionary context, missionary, we'll say majority world, or however you want to put it, outside the United States, and in communities. When I worked initially in back in the U.S. after Burundi, it was in the so-called, one doesn't speak of the inner city anymore, but it was inner city Cleveland, and it was a very different sort of context, which I was challenged by. That, of course, presses one to think differently about how standard ways, not necessarily wrong, but standard Western ways of thinking about the faith come into play. So, yeah, I suppose some of that explains certain interests that I've had. Yeah.
Well, since you've been accused of being too abstract, so let's start with a concrete example. You mentioned it in your introduction, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So talk about Jesus's parable, how it is often used in terms of political imagination, and how you would want us to hear it in terms of your understanding of Christian politics.
Yeah, that's jumping right into the middle of it without a whole lot of guideposts. But I suppose one could say the Good Samaritan has, in a modern context, moved very easily interpretively into being an image of the imperative, the moral and eventually political, to organize political imperative to help those in need, help the poor, help the oppressed, help the marginalized, and so on. And he's a Samaritan, so he's not sort of accepted by the institutional Jewish culture and of the time, and he's left, the Levites and the others leave him and cross the road and so on. I'm sorry, I'm talking about not the Samaritan himself, but the traveler. But the Samaritan, who is this marginalized person, is the one who actually pays attention and therefore represents a kind of the way that justice is embodied by those outside the center of power. So on. Power ignores the needs of those who are, in this case, wounded and left wounded by the side of the road, whereas there's another voice and perspective that comes from outside the center of power. So it's about power politics and ways of looking at things and the moral and political imperative of engaging these things. Obviously, the early church didn't look at it that way, more and large. I say obviously, but just in the sense that they were already outside. They didn't need that. In a major way, they understood the Good Samaritan as Christ and as the one who comes to us from the outside, obviously, and who is rejected and so on, but who is the one who brings life to those who are wounded. So it's allegorized in a certain way. My own reading of it is to go back to just the reality of the people involved. What we have and here I do mention in the book a modern writer who has been very much taken by the parable, Ivan Illich, who was a Catholic social critic, philosopher, theologian in some ways, in the 70s, very much associated with a kind of new left liberationist point of view. Is far more complicated than that, as it turned out. But he picks this up in a major way as a challenge to all kinds of systematizing and institutionalizing of the relationship of charity. He picks it up as an encounter of two people, or an unwillingness to encounter them by those who pass by on the road. That the major challenge is the neighbor. Of course, that's the context of the question. Who is my neighbor? He's the one you meet.
Your actual neighbor.
Neighbor is the one who's nearby. That's what neighbor means. So the one you actually cross paths with. And that's where the calling of engagement, in this case of charity, of expenditure, of concern and compassion and work, gets done. And to that degree, and I agree with that, to that degree, putting this in a political context, the Good Samaritan is meant to shrink our world, at least in terms of political discourse, to immediacies, immediate people, real people who we have to do with. Much of my book is about trying to constrain our political imaginations from the grandiose, systematizing, engulfing frameworks with which we tend to work. And more recently, the church has adopted, Christians have adopted as the way to think about their political responsibilities, to reduce them and constrain them to that place where we live and grow and engage people. And I press the notion of the household even more so as the place where the center of this takes place, which is, by the way, is not an odd idea. It goes back to Aristotle and others, but at least in an initiating way. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
No, that was great. So, like you started right in the middle, and you landed the plane. That was good. So, talk a little bit about the occasion for this book, how it started, and the context. in which you decided
Yeah, I
to
explained
write?
that a little bit at the beginning, and it's worth saying because I certainly get off. Well, I don't know if I get off track that much. I keep coming back to it in the course of the book, but it started out with a desire I had to write a letter to my young adult children about what was important in life. And this was in the middle of COVID, maybe at the front end. I can't remember exactly, but 3 years ago or so. It was a difficult time. I think all of us, maybe we don't remember already. Our memories are short, but it was a difficult time. I had just had some cancer, not very serious, fortunately, but nonetheless, it was something that made me worry. And I worried about them for various reasons, and it was a difficult time. So I wanted to write to them about what I thought was important in life and what they should pay attention to. And in part, it was an offering, not of atonement, but I don't know what to say, for how I felt maybe I had misled them in raising them into thinking other things were important. And, at this point in my life, I thought a lot of what I had taught them, whether mostly tacitly, but nonetheless really was important, was wrong. And these are the things.
Give us an example.
Yeah, well, these are, as I mentioned, I grew up in Berkeley. My father was an academic from a Jewish immigrant family. My mother, similarly, not Jewish. All the values of both from their backgrounds as well as the place we were came to bear on what I was taught, again, tacitly, was important. You make something of yourself. You get a good education. You get a good job. You do good. You contribute to society. Whether you're a doctor or a scientist or this and that, certainly probably not a business person, but you never know. You could do okay if you did it the right way. But maybe, arts were great, but you can't make a good living out of it, and you'll probably struggle and be miserable. So better not that, even though you're trained in that, along with other things. So, and in Berkeley, again, there was this whole political aspect that, again, even though my family was a good liberal democratic family, but they weren't radical in the way some were. But nonetheless, this is what you did. And I passed that on to my kids: go to a good school and make something of yourself, et cetera. And I realized that a lot of this, certainly with the pandemic, it was clear, again, briefly, I think most of us have forgotten this already. And it was already clear to young people, although I think the pandemic made it clear that a lot of these values didn't go anywhere. They didn't add up. A lot of anxiety, a lot of disappointment, a lot of sense of drift, which is still with a lot of young people as far as I can tell. I wanted to write them a letter about what eventually I'd realized was really important. What were the most important things, goods in life? And I laid out in that letter, it was a long letter, but it was still a letter, what I thought they were: understanding ourselves as created in God's image as a man or a woman, and just taking joy in that and receiving that as a good. Our families, being children of parents, growing up with siblings, growing up at all, eventually taking our role in that generational matrix, having friendships, engaging with neighbors, learning how to suffer and what it is, and taking joy in what we're given. And finally, taking all of that and offering it in thanks to God. That's basically, I think, what a human being is supposed to do. The church has a role in this. It comes in at the end of my letter. Neither of my children are particularly engaged in the church. Some more, a little bit more than one, more than others, the other. But in any case, that's what I sent to them. And I got a kind of thank you from them. I think they read it. Maybe they puzzled over it. I don't really know. My son talked a little bit more to me about it than my daughter. But basically, I don't think it kind of fell on fertile soil. And I pondered that. Why not? It wasn't a big mystery. They'd been raised not only by me, but by a culture that had a whole nother set of goals and goods in mind, which they didn't necessarily feel made sense, but nonetheless, that's what they had. And what I offered instead just didn't seem to make sense. So the book comes out of an attempt to think that mismatch through both my letter and why it didn't sort of push the aha moment for my children. I mean, of course, there are lots of reasons that have nothing to do with ideas in them, but and so I worked the book out to try to put a background to the letter. I reworked the letter. The letter appears at the end of the book in a slightly reworked way, but not that much. And the book is kind of one long introduction to a letter to one's children, which, goes in lots of directions, but ultimately aimed at showing why I think the goods I had laid out to them really are goods, and why they're really the basic ones of life that God has given us. So yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, listening to you talk. So Todd, you have kids older than mine. You have grandkids. You have a mother you've had to take care of, and a dad whose health you worry about. And so I'm wondering how much of what Ephraim shares here about what did I pass on versus what would I like to pass on if I had another go at it. Where does this land with you?
Oh, I think about that every day. And I think largely because of the ongoing conversations I have with both my kids. And then, to some of the maybe observations that I have made, particularly, I would say, because of my dad's health, particularly some changes, at least it seems, in how my mom has seen the world. Now, I need to be careful and say that my parents were very instrumental in my understanding of the faith and particular values and such. But when it comes to politics, it was this weird flex um, that's not uncommon, where our political leanings are somehow divorced from our faith commitments. At least is what we, I think, see in the life of Jesus. Um, and so I don't want to say that maybe I had some some of what I may leave shows up in some of those shifts in her conversations of thinking, but I resonate with. In fact, I'll buy the book just for the letter, and I'll copy the letter and make it more personal, maybe to me, and give it to my two girls, because I do really, that is really something that my wife and I talk a lot about. And there are
What I didn't mention, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure clear what this issue of what my kids grew up with and what I gave them and what I now think I wasn't quite right in on that. One of the things that I think our culture, and I'm being broad and caricaturing in this, has inculcated in people is this enormous, voracious sense of insufficiency. Nothing is ever enough.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is ever enough. One is never satisfied. And there are lots of ways this is done. It's not one single thing. And so one of my great goals in the book is to argue for why what we're given by God is in fact enough to be received and celebrated. When you're taking care of parents who are ill, or children who are ill, by the way, which I've done from my side, both sides, one is forced, I think, often to ask the question, should I want more? Is this all just one big disappointment? God, why did you give me this and then take it away? Or let it wilt, or whatever it is. And where did that question, I mean, there are deep places that question comes from love that seems to be stymied at times and so on. But I also think we're taught to think that.
Yeah, it reminds me of the movie where Jack Nicholson comes out of his therapist's office and he looks in the waiting room and he's like, "What if this is as good as it gets?" And your point really is this is good.
That's right.
Like, notice the good that's in front of you.
It is good as it gets on this earth. Now, one of the people have already commented on the book that I don't speak enough about heaven and the resurrection and so on and so forth. Fair enough. I don't want to deny that. But unless we have a sense that our life is good, is worthy, then I don't know what our conceptions of heaven are going to be. I think they're going to be distorted because we will have a conception of God that's distorted. I mentioned in passing in the book, but I've talked a lot about this elsewhere publicly and written about it. My family is riddled with suicide. Mother, sister, and attempts here and there, and blah, blah, blah. To me, that's the nadir of a human sense of life being enough. Clearly, life isn't enough. If it's not enough, you throw it away. It is a reality that suicide is way up amongst young people. Amongst young people in a society where people really do, for all the well, there are a lot of horrible things that happen in them in different places and areas and levels of society, but they have enough to eat and they're not in the middle of all kinds of places, gossip, whatever. And yet people kill themselves with drugs or with anorexia or with violence or simply with suicide, plain old suicide. How did this come to be? I mean, it's just shocking when you think about it. Shocking. And we don't have a good example of this. I do think that the church has a lot to answer for. I'll be honest. We have spent centuries telling people that this world is no good. It's a vale of tears. God, well, it is. I'm not saying it's not that, but
we live in evil days.
We haven't been able to translate that into also a sense that whatever this world is, it's also a gift from God, and we encounter God's goodness here. To me, that's the great challenge right now for Christian churches to be able to do. And we swing back and forth. Everything's awful. I can't wait to get to heaven, or we got to fix this now. Make this better right now, or we don't have the justification to preach the goodness of God. That's my whole argument against this notion of betterment, which is central to modern political concerns, both on the left and the right. It was initially a leftist, progressivist view by definition, but it's similar on the right in many ways. We're going to make it better. We're going to get everything back in order and put it in place, and things will get better. That's the whole political debate amongst candidates and parties and so on.
So in a sense,
I want to banish the word better.
So in a sense, really, it is when we talk about the consequence of all that to young people, it really is the culture or environment they've been given by us, by people my age, that we have lived in such a way that we don't think there is enough. That somehow either, and we play that out in any number of ways, pointing to insufficiencies, and so how in the world wouldn't they internalize that themselves to the level and degree where they would feel as though they are themselves not sufficient, or the world that they've been handed isn't enough. I guess what I'm.
Yeah, I think that's right, Todd.
I guess I'm aiming for the fact that I think we are reaping the whirlwind of what you described, and that's a troubling realization.
I think people have talked about sustainability and so on economically. I think that's good. I mean, in other words, that the issue of always acquiring more wealth or more things and so on is clearly gotten us into trouble socially and so on. Unfortunately, the value of sustainability has not been transferred to the moral interrelational mode. Instead, the sense of needing more and more in certain political contexts have been shifted from the economic realm to the moral realm. And I don't think that's helped. In some ways, that's just as insidious, if not more so, because it's harder to pin down. And as you put it, Todd, it's an internalized kind of conception about who we are as persons. I'm never enough. I mean, the whole culture of self-esteem amongst young people, we can mock it, but there's a reality driving that.
Mhm.
That's not just some kind of thing that somebody invented and foisted on young people. It's something that has grown up in the water. It's being drunk in the water. Yeah.
So help people understand what you call in the book Christian indifferentism. Because I think
I call it that only in the introduction, and a number of people have sort of picked that one out because it sounds bad. Nobody should be morally or politically indifferent.
But it's I was just thinking,
Yeah,
so because right now, it's where I live in the DC metro area, you hear a lot of rhetoric like protect democracy. So it's this maximalist language. In Todd's neck of the woods in Oklahoma, it's make America great again. It's still this giant aspiration. In my own United Methodist denomination, our mission statement is to make disciples for the transformation of the world. So it's again this giant maximalist kind of thing. And what you're pointing to is like with the parable of the Samaritan, like it's a much more specific target.
Right. So that the argument of the book is that the goods of our lives are, as I describe at length, mortal goods. There's no good that we're given in this life that's not a mortal good. That is to say, a good God has given us in our mortal creation. Not everybody's going to agree with me, by the way. This is a theological question as to whether human beings were made mortal or immortal or mortal for immortality and so on and so forth. I'm not dismissing that argument, but I'm taking the side that says, and it's not by the way, decided dogma in the Christian faith for any denomination as tradition, as far as I know. I'm taking the side of somebody like Augustine, who said we were created mortal. And through our obedience, we might have grown into immortality, if you will, to live with God. But our constitution as creatures is that we die. We're liable to death. Everything about us is limited. And that's not that's not evil. That's the nature of being the gifted creation of God. That's just built into what it means to be a creature. So that when we live in this world, the goods that we are given are also mortal goods by definition. They're grasped through our mortal createdness. And that has to do then precisely with these things. I mean, birth and death are the two bookends of our lives. And everything in between, which is only for a few years, is bound up with this set of limitations of being born and dying. Parents and siblings, all the things I just mentioned earlier in this letter, suffering and joy and work. I left out work from the previous list. That's really important. Toil, the fact that we have to work to survive. That's a good. That's not an evil. How we deal with it, how it feels can be good or evil, but not work itself. And so on and so forth. Those are our goods. And so politically, part of my argument is that our Christian duty politically is to tend these goods as goods, to enjoy them in the sense and offer them back to God with thanks. That's our service. The maximalist view of politics, if you will, or whatever, is that there's way more than that. We have to make people better. We have to make systems better. We have to do all this. I argue, and it seems to me incontrovertible, that one can enjoy and tend the mortal goods God has given us in a whole range of political systems, authoritarian ones, not just democratic ones. monarchies, aristocracies, whatever, in the whole tradition of looking at different types of regimes and so on. Christians have actually even been good Christians in the Gulag. I'm not recommending that and not hoping for that or praying for that. There are evils attendant to that. And there are lines, I say. There's a point where the tending of our mortal goods is threatened politically. So I have this whole distinction between normal politics and abnormal politics. Normal politics are the sort of systematic engagements that we have in our communities where we live in a place where we are capable of tending our mortal goods, better or worse, but nonetheless we can do so. When that gets threatened, and it's in times of civil war, perhaps in Iraq, in Gaza, I don't know, whatever, that we move from this normal politics where we can basically let the people who want to spend their time doing political things do it, the same way people can be plumbers and teachers, some people can be politicians. We let them do that, where we move from that context to one where we have to do something to save our mortal goods. That's abnormal. And as I point out, it's rarely good. I mean, we're pressed to do that, to get involved in weird ways. But rarely do we have a whole lot of assurance that we're going to come out of it in a better place, but we still have to do it. Whether, as I said, it's so in the Ukraine. I mean, I hate bringing up these are extreme cases, although they're not that extreme for millions of people.
Yeah.
If you're in the Ukraine, Russia invades, is that a place where you can still tend to your mortal goods, or is that now a time where you move into the abnormal politics of fighting and defending your territory and so on? I don't know, by the way. I'm not sure it's obvious. There are those who would have said, let the Russians come in. What are we going to do? Have all our children killed to protect something? That's not, I don't have to make that decision. Other people have to make that for themselves. But I think by and large, in North America, let's just stay there, we are not in a place of abnormal politics. We are a place where we can let the people who know how to, for better or worse, run the railroads, the electrical grids, the water systems, and so on. If you're in Flint, Michigan, maybe you have to do something else. But and tend to our children, to our parents, and to our neighbors. Now, there's a lot to be done there, by the way. I'm not suggesting that that's a matter of just staying home and watching TV. But the maximalist, or even on the way to maximalist views, I think actually have become toxic for our children and for our country. I'm going to go on a hobby horse. Let me do it briefly. Right
and Todd,
now,
you can jump in.
In our electoral cycle, as I can figure out, we're about to spend $100 billion on this electoral cycle. $50 billion on the campaigns, and another $50 billion on the process and on the media and everything else. I think that's immoral. It's immoral. We should be taking, and you've got billionaires and millionaires giving this and that. Spend the money on a park. Spend the money on teaching people to play instruments. Spend the money on what are you wasting billions of dollars on something that will get us very little in the end, that will make a difference that's in any way lasting. Now, I'm not saying there's no difference between this party and that party's policies, but in the long term, not that much. Not that much. We have way inflated our hopes as to what our political decision making can actually do. And in doing so, we have poured out resources that really ought to be engaged in tending, as I say, our mortal goods more closely and more immediately. And I'm not saying in a privatized, narcissistic way. I mentioned in passing studies that have shown, which I believe, that democracy doesn't even work beyond about 100,000 people. You're lucky if you can get a whole lot of democratic pressures working with 1 million people. But I think we're crazed into thinking that we are making any difference of any considerable way when we're working at numbers of 360 million people. It's not happening.
And I mean, I think our it's clear that our exaggerated hopes politically make it produces a rhetoric that makes it very difficult for us to love our actual neighbors.
Very much so. And that's the indifference I'm talking about. I'm not talking about being indifferent to the needs of people who are in need and so on. I have a whole chapter on generosity and so on. But indifferent to the grand systemic claims that politics is going to change our society and so on and so forth. Obviously, changes take place that are deeply important, but they don't last very long, and they usually make more of a mess than they start out with. I have a reference, again, I may be wrong about this, to a book I still find extremely persuasive by historical demographer Walter Scheidel, who has looked at sort of the course of human history. When has income inequality actually been radically mitigated? And he says, basically, in times of enormous crisis, war, disease, natural disaster, civil dissolution. You can play with it here and there, but is that what we really want?
A dust bowl for everyone.
Yeah.
So Todd, you exist in like the reddest of red America. You have also been engaged politically at the local level. I'm wondering how all this strikes you.
Well, I'm now depressed. $1 billion on an election. That really, honestly, truly will not make the sort of differences that are claimed. So, and I didn't have to know that we spent $1 billion to be dissatisfied with what the outcome will mean.
100 billion is where we're going to end up.
100 billion.
100 billion.
Yeesh. I'm even more depressed now. No, I think what so maybe I use illustrate. I got a friend. We've become pretty good friends, but we are so opposite on the political spectrum to the degree that I just prefer to maintain my friendship rather than talk about specifics. And even when he'll send me a video or a link or something, and we might lightly engage. Um, I think I think that neither one of us, um, in whatever ideological pursuit we have to persuade the other, will make our friendship better if I win or he wins in that debate. And so the moral good of our friendship has been really good, if I can use your terms, having not read your book. That good of friendship is frankly more valuable than whether or not I can convince him that the government is not steering hurricanes toward certain parts of the country. And so I think so that that is a to me there's a bit of a and this may surprise Jason. To me, there's a bit of a more calming effect that if we're spending our time in gratitude for those things, receiving them as gift, and then returning um, what we have received with gratitude, it seems to be a much greater investment. And that circles me all the way back to your letter to your children. That rather than fire my grown daughters up about my political machinations, impressing on them the goods that they have and that have been made available to them, and the ways in which they can receive them, invest in them, and then return gratitude for them, is a far better remainder to leave them than that I had a particular opinion about the 2024 election.
And
So
one of the things
that's
in
kind of
the
how it
first
strikes me.
Yeah. First chapter of the book is looking at sort of letters to children and how they turned into valedictorian style
Mhm.
convocation style addresses, which have ended up being these grand callings to young people to change the world. And, I have great admiration for the young people who have decided they're going to, go work for nonprofits and prison reform groups and human rights things and so on. I have great admiration. There's nothing, I don't want anybody to hear me saying that this is bad. I do worry, though, that that commitment is also being driven by a huge wind of inflated hopes that leads to disappointment, deep disappointment, or keeping disappointments. By all means, people should feel able, if they so choose, and willing to go and work for groups that help other people in these ways. But somehow we have gotten to the point that if you don't do that, you're failing in your commitment to the world that God has given you. And you die, quite frankly, with a sense of deep despair at what the world is. I've seen that happen. I have seen that happen. The number of missionaries, by the way, I just got some letters about this from some friends, who now in their 80s, they're not sure they believe it anymore. Now, this is not quite the same thing, but it's an analogy. Jason, you were talking about the United Methodist notion of making disciples to sort of change the world and so on. I think that my generation had a lot of that, especially not in maybe the less fundamentalistic side of the missionary culture, but nonetheless, I was in a pretty evangelical set of missionary engagements and so on. I think people had this sense that by doing what they were doing, the world would be a better place for God, for Jesus, for the good, for whatever. And at age 80, I can count several people I know who say, I'm not sure I even believe any of this stuff anymore. By this stuff, I'm talking about some of the fundamental characteristics of the Christian faith. Deep disappointments around this. How did that happen? Well, I think it's an analogous thing that has gone on in certain circles of the church, missionary or outreach circles of the church, that actually is very much in tune with a larger cultural sensibility about making things better and changing everything. And when Jesus returns, is he going to find the world a better place than it was when? I mean, it's odd that we would ever think that when he says, when I return, it's going to be worse. He says that. Why do we think that it's not going to be that way? That doesn't mean you don't do things, but we've got to find a way to find joy and satisfaction in giving ourselves to what is good without the kind of metrics of expansionary metrics of reward that somehow we've been taught we're supposed to expect.
I mean,
Yeah.
I just anecdotally in my own kind of neck of the Christian church, I think it's both a high anthropology and a low Christology that you find in mainline Christianity, such as the United Methodist Church. It contributes to a lot of this.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
That we overestimate our ability to do things, to do the good, and at the same time, we've reduced Jesus to a teacher of the past, and it's up to us to continue to continue the movement of the dead Jesus. And I have a friend so in the United Methodist Church, every annual conference we have, like in Virginia, all the retiring pastors that year are brought up on stage to be recognized, and there's usually a sermon and a service for that. And I have a friend who says he would like to preach that retirement service and just look at all of these baby boomers and absolve them of their inability to do the things they got into ministry to do, and to remind them that those were all inappropriate goals to begin with, and they're forgiven.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know what would happen after that service. There would be a few people who would have tears of relief
Mm-hmm.
and thanks. But I think there'd be also a lot of people who would still resist this with tears of almost of kind of disappointment and anger.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to project into anybody else. But
well, you mentioned Luther quite a few times in your book, and it does. Your book does read like you're commending something like a Lutheran understanding of Christian vocation. That's pared down to the world around you, the immediate world around you.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I mean, I think Luther got a lot right. He got a lot wrong too, because as all of us, he was not a consistent person, well integrated. And his mood swung, deep moods from one side of something to another. But still, I think the basic theology of the cross, although understood in a certain way, is right. I mean, that's what we're given. It's not like Luther didn't believe in the resurrection, but he didn't think you could sort of map that on to the place of goodness God has given us here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just I preached on Romans 13 last Sunday, the first 7 verses. And looking at that again, it's clear that when Paul talks about being obedient to the governing authorities, he's really thinking about the people that you would run into in your everyday life who work in that capacity. It's not this abstract network called the government. It's the people in your daily life, and to try to not get involved in altercations with them.
Yeah,
so
I think that's right.
So it's a much more
it'd be
limited.
useful to think in those terms precisely. Who are the people Paul is talking to, rubbing shoulders with in this governing community? And we hear about them, of course, in the Gospels. Centurions and tax collectors and this, that, and the other. These are, I mean, we have tended to reify all these things. It's a kind of modern allegorizing, which is kind of funny. You've sort of taken a thing and you've sort of pumped the whole thing up so that it covers the world. Whether it's the Good Samaritan or the Zacchaeus or whoever. But I think you're right. I think getting it back down to the flesh and blood people that we actually, as you put it, rub shoulders with and encounter is a better.
Yeah, it's just let go of Donald Trump, let go of Kamala Harris, and how do you treat the person at the DMV? that seems to be a more relevant.
Well, and there is a lot of politics that is, Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. Well, it should be, but it's not. It should be. Because that's the only place where our encounters actually have an effect, for good or ill, but have an actual effect that in some ways not only depends on us, but comes back to us and shapes us.
So are you, I know this is a critique that you get. Are you hopeful for the church for the future?
Well, see, I had this idea that the pandemic was going to kind of help us recalibrate our focus. It didn't. But the next one might a little more. So I'm not hopeful in the sense that we're going to just sort of, somebody's going to come along and we're going to have, he or she or a bunch of people, movement will sort of have this great effect and we'll right the ship and so on. No, I don't think that's going to happen. I think things have to get a lot worse before they get a lot better. But that's only because to me, that's sort of That's history.
Mhm.
That's history. It's not because I know people think I can be a Jeremiah and so on, but Jeremiah is history. Jeremiah isn't just some outlier. That's how the church has grown and
Yeah, no.
its movements back and forth. I also don't think the church is on its way to, there isn't this long line of progress. The church has places. The church is always a place where we can and do encounter God. Now the question is what we're hearing of God and what He's offering us. So whether it's big or small or struggling or booming or I don't know, we think it's faithful or unfaithful, we're always encountering God there. And to that degree, I'm hopeful. Am I ever hopeful? The whole point of our life is to live with God. That's why He made us. And we can live with God anywhere, at any time. We can also run from God anywhere at any time. But if we're committed to the church's life, then we have nothing to fear about where it is and how it is. It might not get written up the way some people want it written up, but anyway, I am hopeful, of course.
Todd,
I love living. I love going to church, and I'm speaking in a very simplistic way, and being able to pray with others. Period.
So, what kind of church do you attend in Denver?
Well, this is getting personal. I don't want to surprise anybody. I'm an ordained Episcopal priest. I've had my ups and downs for obvious reasons with the Episcopal Church, and some of its theological and political commitments. I'm also engaged in the Anglican Communion, Africa and Asia and elsewhere, so on. Right now, my wife and I are attending a Roman Catholic parish.
Okay.
Not to become Roman Catholics, but to be in a place where the prayers I just mentioned are said together with a great deal of, I think, integrity and genuineness. And that's for now, and that's for here. I think people who know my writing know I'm committed to the ecumenical vision of a one body, one church in a visible form of life. So I'm not apologizing for not for moving around a little bit, but not in the sense of it doesn't matter. It matters a lot, but you have to live it in a concrete way. Anyway, so that's what we're doing right
now. Okay. Todd, last thought.
Well, I think I'll join you in being hopeful. I think there's always reason to hope because of the promise given us in Jesus, and so I'll hold on to that hope even when I'm despairing over $100 billion. I'm going to hold on to hope.
I didn't mean to pull the rug out from under you on that little statistic, and it may be exaggerated, although I don't think it is by much.
It is. I have thought about it. So my youngest son just turned 18, so this will be the first time he gets to vote, and I have thought about how do you impress upon him the need to take that responsibility seriously, but also not to reduce the entire meaning of life to that responsibility.
Well, I am quite certain we just got in the mail the Denver or Colorado voting, official voting guide with all the amendments in it. This is just for Colorado. I don't know how many pages this is, 200. Who's reading that? I don't know. That's not where we meet God. Yep. And that is not where Jesus comes to us. I'm not saying He doesn't care about this or that aspect, but Todd, your point is the promises of the Lord in Christ Jesus are for now, here, always. the kingdom of God is among you or near you or with you. Take it all kinds of different ways, but one way you can't take it is that the kingdom of God is somewhere you are not able to grasp or be grasped by.
Right.
So that's all the hope.
Yep.
And I'm certain of that. God is wonderful and beautiful. And when he speaks in Christ, his voice can be heard in any place at any time.
Well, the book is Mortal Goods. It's good to see you and talk to you again.
Likewise.
I know.
Glad to be with both of you.
I know Joel Steiner will be glad that you joined us. So.
Okay, well, greetings to everybody that we know in common, but also to those we don't know in common, because this is a real privilege, and I appreciate it, both Jason and Todd, both of you. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you.
And I will press stop here.